Welcome to the Empower LEP Podcast. I'm your host, Jana Parker. I'm a licensed educational psychologist. I'm a group practice owner, and I am the owner and a mentor at Empower LEP. Today, I'm hosting Stefan Oste. He is an educational therapist. He is a health and wellness coach, and he is a special educator. And he is the first person who I've had on the podcast who's transitioned from being a special education teacher in a non-public school setting to a private practice owner. And so hearing his story as a like-minded professional was super interesting for me. He is a great referral partner for me. And he's somebody in the Bay Area who really specializes in math, which is always kind of difficult to find people like that, and executive function, which is always a hot commodity. So I hope you like the conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. I also want to say, if you could do me a favor and give this podcast some 5-star ratings and reviews, that would be greatly appreciated, because then people can find it. And if you could follow my Instagram page, that would be really helpful as well. So I'm at Empower LEP on Instagram, and follow and rate the podcast. Thanks. Welcome back to the Empower LEP Podcast. I am here today with Stefan Oste, who has a really cool name. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenna.
You are welcome. So I invited Stefan on here because he and I are referral partners. He is the kind of person who works in the same field as me. And as you all know, networking is extremely important. So I met Stefan a while back, and we've stayed connected because he has a practice of his own. And sometimes the kids that I see for testing need him, and sometimes the kids that he sees in practice need me. So it's been nice to have, we're part of this networking group that has different conversations and kind of reaches out when people either have a professional question or need a referral for something. And so it's been really nice to kind of know you over the last couple of years.
Yeah, likewise. And thank you so much for your recent help, which is how we reconnected. I was like, I have a try coming up, and I need a psychologist who knows their stuff, because I'm pretty sure this kid's not going to get what they need.
Yeah. And you know what's also interesting is that I saw a couple, it's like people in networking groups will answer questions. And it's interesting to see, like, of the couple of people who at least publicly answered that question, the response was different from the lens of the person,
Mm-hmm.
So like, I really took that as an opportunity to think about, because this is a kid who is in public school, and so going, like, that's really my niche, right? That's really my area of expertise. Like, why would an assessment be a certain way in public school versus private practice? What might parents do? What is the school obligated to do versus not? And that's a lot different from somebody who is going to give you guidance from just a different perspective of, like, not a school psychologist, So it was interesting for me seeing the different responses come through, and you probably got something from all of them, but it's interesting to see how responses to a question can be different, just given different professionals' lenses.
Yeah, it was really informative. Also, thank you on behalf of the parents. I forgot to mention that earlier, but yeah, I'm just really grateful for this community, and it was super helpful in hopefully getting this kid what they need, and, leaning on the district to just do a little bit extra.
Right. Well, so on that note, I guess we should tell our audience what Stefan does. So
I'm still working that out.
So before I butcher it, talk to me about, tell me about you and the practice that you do now. And then I'm going to take you back in time to see how you got there.
Yeah, definitely. So right now I'm an educational therapist / national board certified health coach / EF coach / credentialed special ed teacher. But the really important thing when I get a referral is just, can I help this person, be the best kind of complete version of themselves, both inside of school and then outside of school? Because school, it's part of real life, but the real life that they always talk about in school, that's kind of feels like you're kicking the can down the road, and half your life is outside of school. So what can we do for you there?
Hmm.
especially if your needs aren't going to be fully met in the school setting.
Yeah, yeah. And I want to hear more about your current practice, but I want to take you back in time first because I think
Mhm.
that talking about how you got to where you are now will help kind of paint the picture for what you're doing in your practice now.
Yeah, definitely. How far back are we going?
Well, let's go to like how you started out your professional career and like what inspired you, and then like where did you find yourself working?
Hmm. So I guess my love of psychology began maybe as early back as middle school. Definitely by high school, I was reading a lot of Oliver Sacks, and it really got me thinking about the question, like what is humanity? What's the human experience? What's intelligence? And, what happens when people just are, totally outside what we consider to be the norm. So from there, I got my undergrad degree in developmental psychology and philosophy and behavior science. So kind of sticking with the same kind of thing.
Yeah. And
And
then you,
then,
and where
sorry, go
did,
ahead.
oh, yeah, sorry, I was just going to say, and then like where did you end up for a career?
So my first job out of college was working as like a behavior slash classroom counselor at an expulsion school within a broader mental health based non-public agency, I guess.
Was
But
that,
for the first two,
was that in the Bay Area?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, my first couple of years, it was more about how to behaviorally support kids when they're inside the class, but also when they need to take some time out of class to self-regulate or just get any other kind of needs met. And it was really, really, really cool because every kid had, a therapist, an OT if they needed, speech and language. And me being the curious person I am, I always would pull those people aside and be like, hey, so what exactly are you doing with this kid? So I got to learn about a lot of the different professional angles, but then ultimately the care philosophy was how can we do whatever it takes to get this kid to succeed? So a lot of restorative justice based practices, a lot of nonviolent communication based practices. And at these schools, there was a no kicking the kids out policy. So basically, if something wasn't going well, you had to figure out how to fix it. And I even hesitate to use the word fix, but basically, you have to find a way.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you worked in like a kind of supportive capacity before you became a
Mm-hmm.
special education teacher.
Yeah.
And what kind of prompted you to go get that credential and become a special education teacher?
Yeah. So I was honestly kind of torn between becoming a teacher, becoming a therapist, and those had kind of been two of my career aspirations. Again, probably going back to middle school. But just the timing was a little bit better for becoming a teacher. So I went with that.
Yeah. Did you stay and at the job that you were at that same
Mm-hmm.
school?
Yep. So working full time and then taking night classes for a year
Mm,
and a half.
yeah. Okay. And then how long were you the teacher and case manager of the program?
So after I finished my credential, I actually ended up going to a different program, but I was a teacher and case manager there for about 7 years.
Okay. And what was your experience like as a special education teacher?
Exciting and totally overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah, that's honest. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, like the kids were amazing. And I loved, learning that so much of this work is relational and about, emotions and meeting people where they are. And then it's also really cool just to be surrounded by other really brilliant, caring people.
Yeah.
So I would say that's one thing that I do really miss in my current private practice since I'm just flying solo. But I love the fact that there are opportunities to collaborate, like talking to you or the message board, or when a kid has more than one service provider. And then also talking with the kid and the parents and the teachers just about, okay, how is that going to look, in the 99 hours a week that you don't see me?
Hmm. Yeah. So what were the parts of the job that were really overwhelming, and what are the parts that you weren't in love with?
So the overwhelming part was I was, at this point, probably 26 years old and unbeknownst to myself, already pretty burnt out for my first 4 years of just doing behavior
Yeah.
and undiagnosed ADHD at the time. So, like the constant paperwork, standards, lesson plans, grading, instructional minutes, backwards design, reactive behavior plans, IETs, WASC reviews. Just like, what do I do with any of this? And, where's the time for the kids?
Right.
And, intellectually, I could wrap my head around like, okay, you know, there are rules, all this has to be in place for a reason. But I was like, okay, this is not why I got into this job.
Right. Right.
And then on the flip side, I could be having just the most overwhelming, crazy day for 7 hours. And if I could get 10 minutes with a kid where they came and they're like, okay, Stefan, like, I don't know how to talk to this person. Can you like help me come up with a plan? Or Stefan, I need to study for the high school exit exam. Do you have 15 minutes? That was enough to make up for the entire rest of the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then also, as I got to know the IEP process, I found myself really, when it came down to the actual meeting and sitting in the room and advocating on the kids' behalf, like a whole different side of me would come out. And I'm just like, I don't care if there are 10 of you. I don't care if this kid missed the mark by like 2%. How can we give this kid what they need?
How was that received by the schools?
I'll say initially I was going to say about as well as you'd expect, but this whole line of work is full of people who are really here because they care about the work and the mission. And there are a lot of times where, for lack of a better word, the system gets in the way and you feel torn between two sides.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a hard part of, really figuring out what you could put on the school and what's just a larger issue. And, often the schools would reply with, okay, we have room for 10 kids to get this service. Is this like, do this kid's needs really fall in like the top 10 most extreme kids? And, sometimes they would even be like, how do you feel about like taking this resource away from someone else? And it just, yeah, your face says it all. And like being a teacher is the hardest job you can think of. And that never really sat right with me, but I also didn't feel like I could realistically put that on the school. So, the options are, okay, fine, I'll do it myself with, whatever limited time and energy I have, or just like, oh, wow, the system sucks and there's another one through the cracks.
Yeah. Yeah. It's one of the things that I am thankful every day now in my practice that I don't have to say, no or hide a service or, I mean, I was just working with a family recently where we knew that we knew that the district had a program, but the district wasn't sharing that with the family because they didn't have room. But we knew, that it existed. And we just thought like, what if this were a family who like, so we ended up being able to work around that because we did know, right? But I mean, for all the families that wouldn't even know to ask, wouldn't understand like how things like that worked. It's like, you can't not offer a program to a kid because you don't have space, but it happens all the time.
I mean, you can. Like whether or not that's ethical or legal, that's a whole other can of worms.
Right. So yeah, it's just, yeah. So that got to me too in the schools. And I'm glad that I don't have that barrier anymore.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what was ultimately the source of my burnout was, just recognizing that we were doing everything we could. I was surrounded by the most amazing people, but time and energy are a limited resource, and at some point something has to give.
Yeah.
And I found myself getting very kind of cynical, saying, okay, well, like the job's never done, the work's never done, nothing is ever going to be enough. And, what do I do with that? I still, I have a partner, I have a life outside of work, and something has to give.
Yep. Yep. So, so what made you take the leap and like, how did you do that?
So it was definitely a trial by fire. I'll back up a little bit.
Sure.
So while I was a teacher, I was going to these professional development trainings on like really specialized math instruction. And that was my intro to the world of ET because I'm a chatty guy. I'm really curious. I genuinely like to know what everyone's story is. And people kept being like, oh, I'm an ET. I'm an ET. I'm like, what is that? So they're like, oh, well, it's like, and pardon me in advance to AET if I miss some marks, but it's basically like, oh, it's someone who specializes in like how to learn and the emotional aspect of learning and who understands, cognitive testing and intervention. I'm like, don't I already do that?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Especially working in like really intensive mental health based school programs where like the most important thing is the entire kid. And, if there were these giant crises that would pop up, in the moment, you could be like, okay, forget academics because that's not really what this person needs right now. And they're going to remember the person who like really helped them through this extreme crisis, not the person who taught them math.
Right.
Yeah. So I think 2 years before I left teaching, I started a private tutoring practice because one of my classmates was essentially like, hey, I'm full. I think you're perfect for this kid. I gave the parents your information. This is what you're going to charge. And cool. You don't have to say yes. And I was like, I'm going to say yes.
Yeah.
And I was like totally freaked out because it was the first time I'd ever done it, for that much money per hour. And, for some reason, the stakes felt a lot higher because I'm like, well, if this person doesn't like me, they'll fire me.
Right. Right.
But I went with it and I ended up absolutely loving it because, I really got to know the kid. I got to look at all the psych reports and do all my own assessments and work with the school. And they were going to this, like, one of those really high achieving, like, pressure cooker college prep schools, but they had all these needs from like years ago that hadn't really been addressed. And I started to be able to put on my advocate hat again, where they were like, oh, well, this kid needs to be doing algebra 2. And I'm like, this kid doesn't understand fractions. So why do you think algebra 2 is going to make any sense?
Yeah.
And, I laid it out for the school and for the parents. And I was like, okay, school learning specialist, math teacher, try to make like the concepts click at the higher level, but like I have to go back to where it all started to make sense.
Yeah.
And build up from there. So that's what I did. And, the students slowly but surely started to make these really good gains. And that got the attention of the school learning specialist. And then they were like, oh, I have this other kid who's struggling. Like, are you taking other clients?
Yeah. Awesome. And so this was while
definitely.
So you were still in schools at this time, but someone catapulted you into starting to take on clients and you were just like trial by fire. And okay, now I have a business. And then you look good to a learning specialist at another school because they see the work that you're doing. And then all of a sudden you got some clients.
Yeah, exactly. And, the more I did it, the more I was just totally falling in love with it. And then it was kind of these two diverging worlds of, I'm doing the best I can. And, this is not about like my former setting at all. I have nothing but good things to say about it. It's just being a teacher is not the right job that suited my cognitive or neurological profile.
Yeah.
And I was like, I do little pieces of brilliant work here and there, but for the most part, I'm just kind of floundering and burning out. And then I leave every day and I drive to these people's homes and I get to do, whatever I want.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of trust that comes with that. And, I hold myself to a very high standard. But it was I don't know, it just felt there was something so cool about just having the freedom to say, okay, I'm making a really educated, creative decision about what I think is going to click for this kid.
Yep. Using your
And you,
professional judgment and
mhm.
expertise. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes that means using that really structured math program that I put 700 hours of professional development classes into and worked with mentors on over the years. And sometimes it's saying, okay, like you're leaving me a little breadcrumb here. You seem curious about something that my scope and sequence says you're not ready for, but you saw it in class and you linked it to a couple other things. So yeah, let's go there.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. You just have like
Mhm.
creative flexibility.
Yeah, and we would end up putting together these like really cool concepts with it, and then eventually we'd hit a wall where I'm like, okay, I'm amazed with what you've put together so far. This is learning. It's you creating your own kind of picture or idea of something. And, math is incredibly cumulative. It's the most structured subject there is. So if you're missing a piece way down the line, it's going to show up somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how long did it take for you then, once you started, to actually be like, okay, I'm going to leave the school and do this full time?
So it wasn't, it was a decision that was kind of in the works. My wife was in medical school at the time, so I had committed to, handling all of our finances, and that required me to have a full-time job and be doing my side thing.
Yeah.
But, about halfway through her second year, I think the burnout just had totally caught up with me. I was probably, in it a year or two longer than I should have been. And my body just started totally shutting down. And, I talked to my wife about it. I talked to my family, my close network of friends. And I think this was in late September. And, I felt this giant obligation to my colleagues and told the kids I was working with at the school.
Yeah.
But they're like, well, can you hold out till winter break? And I'm like, I don't know if I can hold out till tomorrow.
Yeah. Wow. You're at a critical point.
Yeah. So, I sat down and had a talk with my director, and I was like, okay, look, like, I don't think I can do this anymore. She's like, kind of saw this coming for the past month.
Wow.
So, I did what I could to get a transition in place, but, I had a lot of guilt about that for a really long time.
Yeah. It was like the beginning of a school year.
Yeah. And, initially I had said, okay, last year was my last year, but they weren't at staffing capacity, and they were like, well, do you have one more lap in you? And I wanted to have one more lap in me, but I just didn't.
Yeah. 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 All right. So you left, and then, how did you start to build your practice? And was it like in person? Was it virtual at that time? Like, how did you build that?
Yeah, so this was fall of 2019, and I'd been seeing all of my students outside of work in person. I had them in little geographic clusters. But I took a couple days just to like really sit with the fact that I had quit my, job that paid the bills and given up my health care. And, I was just like, okay, like it's the end of an era. You're losing this part of your identity, and how the hell are you going to pay your bills next month?
Yeah.
I think I had a couple months of savings lined up, but there was no long-term plan at that point. So I reached out to everyone I'd ever taken the classes with, everybody I knew at every other school, and I said, hey, I'm open for business full time. Like, here's the deal. I just quit. I'm kind of burnt out, but I have enough to do this because it's so energizing and it's so fun. And like, if you guys think I'm doing good work, if the parents keep hiring me, if the parents keep putting my name out there, I must be doing something well.
Yep.
And within a couple of weeks, I had a full-time practice.
Yeah. Isn't that funny how that works? Yeah. I mean, I'm talking constantly about how important it is to have a network, and how every relationship that you build everywhere, whether it's in your direct field, like whether it was at your professional development things, whether it was at your school sites, and even just people who you know, when you start putting it out there to the world, that's when you have to just talk about it to everybody you know.
Yeah. And that was my approach. But just the way I am, like I haven't done social media in forever. I do LinkedIn the least amount humanly possible, but I'll talk to 10 strangers on the street if I'm at the grocery store.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is I think there may be 0 degrees of separation between me and someone who has a kid or an adult who's struggling with some kind of learning challenge.
Yeah. Yep. When you moved into full-time practice, were you still doing it in person or were you virtual? Okay.
Yeah. So moving full-time was fall of 2019. So little did we know.
Right.
And I think in 2019, I took on one virtual client who was in another state from a connection I'd made in those math classes. So that was my first taste of teaching virtually. And then, what was it, March of 2020, all of a sudden life became online.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. We were on the same trajectory, by the way. Like I didn't jump ship in 2019, but I knew in the 2018-2019 school year that was like my first year as a program specialist and my year that I realized that was definitely not how I wanted to keep living my life. So in January 2020 is when I left the practice that I had been at and on the side and started my own practice, which was right before March 2020. Yeah. So.
Yeah. And for you, was that kind of a gradual, well-plotted transition, or was it the same kind of trial by fire? Like, I have to figure this out fast because if I don't, then bad things are going to happen.
No, mine was definitely gradual. So I made a decision in the fall of 2019 that I was going to leave at some point. And so I was like, okay, well, I need to start my own practice. So I left the practice that I was at, started my own, but I thought, okay, I'm going to stick this out a couple more years. One, because I wanted to have at least 15 years in the schools. 2, because I needed to have 3 years at this like higher salary for CalSTRS,
Okay.
like, okay, well, if I'm going to get so much less of my pension, but if I get 3 years, so I'm like 3 consecutive years at this higher rate of pay, then that at least will be a little bit more of something when I'm old. But so when I left, I was able to like just start slowly. So it was totally opposite of what you did. So I started slowly and I just saved everything that I made working like in my private practice besides what I was spending on the business because I still had a full-time job. But then I did 2 more school years and then left.
Then it was just time to go.
Yeah. It was just time to go. Yeah. So I planned it out a little bit more. So I didn't have to just Yeah.
Yeah. I think every abrupt career choice I've ever made has been, I quit because I just need to, and I trust myself to figure out the next step.
Yeah. Yeah. You listened to what you needed. So then everything transitioned to online. And so you were able to continue to have your practice because everything was online.
Yeah. And, that was a lot of learning curves rolled into one because I learned that, some kids can actually do maybe even better online than in person. And some other kids really, really, really need in person.
Yeah.
But that first year, it was just about like, let's do what we can, let's get through it. And then let's start to kind of figure out if there are other in-person options. And then also what happened in that first year was my wife and I moved across the bay for her job. So there was no more option to go back in person to any of these students once the restrictions started to lift. So then that was when I started to realize the importance of having a network when, I'd have these very frank conversations with parents and kids like, all right, I see how hard you're trying. I swear I'm trying really hard. It's just not clicking ethically. Like, let's find you something better in person.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I love that you do that because there are some kids who just cannot in virtual. At my practice right now, we have virtual and in person, and we have to figure out who needs what for sure.
Yeah. And that's something I still navigate whenever I get new referrals. And yeah, it's kind of hard because you want to try everything, but you also want to make sure that you're a great option, not just the best of kind of whatever options.
Yeah. So tell me about your practice now. So yeah, like tell me about your specialties and how you kind of like what kinds of clients are your niche? Because now after 5 years of practice, I'm sure you're like kind of knowing who fits with you best.
I'm knowing and I'm always learning.
Yeah.
So yeah, now I'm kind of split between math and executive function. I'm finding I really love middle school through high school math. And that's where a lot of kind of ETs and tutors really tend to tap out.
Right.
They're like, I'll go through middle school, I'll maybe do algebra 1, but like I can't touch geometry, I can't touch algebra 2. I used to say I don't do pre-calc, but then I just had enough students going into pre-calc and I couldn't find people to refer out to. So I would just take their syllabus and I would just relearn a couple lessons ahead of time.
Yeah.
And then, having done that 10 times by now, I'm like, oh, I guess I do know pre-calc.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. Still haven't made the jump to AP Calc. But I do find, at least with a couple of students of mine who have made it that far, that at that point, it's really, they don't need a ton of my help. It's just around like, okay, how can we like structure your thinking a little better? Or, hey, are you talking this out as you go? Hey, how can you attend to details? I have a lot of students who have like either multiple diagnoses or kind of fall in the ADHD 2E realm.
Yeah.
So I like the kids who are like, really bright and curious, but don't really learn in the way that it's taught at school.
Right.
And then I also really like the fact that with a lot of these students, the reason that they have trouble accessing the higher level stuff is they're super bright, but they never got those foundations in the first place.
Right.
So, as long as it's kind of reasonable in terms of can we address the higher stuff and can we also address the foundations, it tends to work pretty well.
Yeah. And do you do kind of like a math EF combo?
Math, like every single thing you do in life involves executive function. We were talking about that before we hit play, but
Yep.
Every conscious intentional action has to run through your active working memory. So for math, like what do you have to do? You have to look at a problem. You have to engage your self-talk. And you're like, okay, what am I even reading? What kind of problem is this? How do I know what type of problem this is? What mental file do I pull? How do I keep all these steps in order? And how do I also attend to detail at the same time? And then how do I know that I know?
Yep. Yeah.
So I always say that like number one, you can turn almost anything in life into a math problem, but then math in a way can also be really good training for executive function, at least for kind of problem solving in the moment. Maybe not as much for like really long-term things, but then that's where we get into just the pure executive function.
Yeah. Well, tell me about your executive function and your health and wellness coaching as well.
Yeah. So I've kind of, during, I guess, 2020, I toyed with the idea of going back to grad school to become a therapist. But at this point, I was also doing a ton of my own work. I'm like, okay, I'm super burnt out. I probably need my own therapist. And I'd had therapists at different points in my life.
Yeah.
I was also doing kind of a lot of community-based work and like small group work. And that was really my intro to professional coaching. And I was like, okay, somehow this feels way different than therapy. But it was just something that really kind of spoke to me. And one of the things that you do whenever you go on a career search, one of the first things they tell you is talk to all your friends and coworkers and just say, okay, what do you see? So every coworker I talked to, I was like, guys, I want to be a therapist. And they're like, why? And initially I was like, ouch. But then, they're like, well, like, don't get me wrong, you can hold space for people well, but, you also kind of tend to be like you feelings when things get really in the weeds. And that was incredibly good advice because I had my application lined up and again, I go to hit send and I'm just like, I don't want to take 2 years off of work and not earn money and go 100K into debt when I'm not excited about this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
So I did what like one of my mentor coaches would tell me over and over and over again, still to this day, which is just slow the F down, just sit with it. And when you think you can't sit with it any longer, keep sitting with it. And eventually you're going to feel the answer. It's not going to come from out here, but you're just going to be like, all right, this feels right in my body, or this feels kind of icky.
Yep.
Yeah. So I sat with the decision to go into coaching programs for a really long time. And then I was like, okay, this feels right. I don't exactly know where I want to take it, but I know I want to do this just for my own kind of self-learning. And I also think it's really going to help the kids I work with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I started to do that. And then at the same time, I started to go through the professional ET process.
Oh, geez. So you're doing both programs at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot. And working full time?
I was working. So my wife got hired in 2020, and then we had to talk about finances and making sure we were both doing our part. So then, me being the mathy person, I was like, okay, what's the fewest number of hours I can work to uphold all my financial obligations and hit my investment goals, but then just have time to kind of refigure out who I am as a person.
Yep.
And I think I was probably mid-30s at the time, and I don't think I'd been in a place to really just stop and slow down since I was 22.
Right.
So about 10 years of deferred maintenance. Yeah, so that's when I got really into like taking care of my physical health again and being active as much as possible, focusing on like sleep, meditation, and just really reconnecting with people. So, talking to at least one good friend every single day and just being real, like, how are you doing? Oh, not great, or oh, great. Okay, tell me more about that. And then ending every single conversation with a really earnest, well, look, I love you. Let's do this again soon. Yeah. So I think that COVID post teacher burnout time was a period of reconnection with life outside of teaching and just with myself and getting to really reprioritize having enough energy for relationships.
Yeah. That's awesome. Oh,
Yeah,
what a
in turn,
nice thing.
Yeah. Well, then in turn, like I started doing better and better work.
Yeah. Amazing. I mean, the I feel like the opportunity to choose how you spend your time is really a gift.
It is. It's also executive function.
It is also executive function. Yeah. Uh-huh. So how do you work with kids on this? And are you working with adults too? Like, what does your population of people look like that you're working with now?
Yeah. So the executive function has been evolving for maybe the past 3 years because I started, I learned a tiny bit about it in teaching school and then a tiny bit about it in professional development, but it was the really cursory, easily Google searchable, like planning, organization, time management, folders. And I had an initial just like, ugh, so boring approach to it.
Yeah.
Which is not to say these things aren't important because it's all part of environmental design, which comes from a coaching principle. But I've always been the type of person who just asks those extra like what's and whys. So I'm like, okay, well, why is it important to do this? Why is it important to do this? And along the way, I ran into a really cool other community that was focusing on executive function. And they totally opened my eyes to the fact that, like, okay, that health coaching program you just did, like, what does it take to plan this vision? That's nonverbal working memory. That's feeling into what sensations make sense. And then, all right, how do you break that into little steps? How do you keep yourself accountable? How do you course correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you do when things don't go your way? All of that's executive function.
Right.
So then I was like, okay, I think I love executive function.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I was a couple of years into running my own business, and I was like, okay, I love how I show up for clients, but behind the scenes, I'm still kind of a mess. Like, I'm making it work, but things that other people say take half an hour to do, it takes 3 hours for me to do. So I probably have some executive dysfunction stuff, but, I'd look up ADHD in the DSM and I'm like, no, not quite. But then I'd mention it to a bunch of my colleagues, and all of them are like, wait, nobody ever like flagged that as like clear as day. And I'm like, well, no, I've like held a job, and oh, wait, maybe this all makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, then my therapist at the time was like, like these other diagnoses you're coming in with, been doing this for 30 years, like they don't make any sense. Have you considered ADHD? So then, I got an evaluation with a really good psychiatrist who was like, okay, let's go through all of your school records ever since you were a kid.
Wow.
And I was like, well, no, like, I always got straight A's. And, they were like, most things come easy. If things are hard, doesn't want to do them, can't sit still, doesn't regulate his emotions, really sweet kid, but occasionally makes these like terrible impulsive decisions and then feels really bad about them. And then, all the way through college, I'd gotten like B's with the occasional C or D. And it was the same thing. It's like, well, how did you study for exams? I'm like, wait, what do you mean studied? Or how did you write your term papers? Oh, the night before they were due. And he's like, how do you write a 20-page term paper the night before it's due? I'm like, somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I didn't sleep for 2 days, but I got a good enough grade on it.
Right.
Yeah. So he was like, well, you clear as day need it. And at this time too, I felt like I'd done everything I could. I'd done this coaching program. I've been working with an executive function coach. I've been working with another coach on like trying to figure out the direction of my life, because I felt this really kind of unsettled feeling.
Mm-hmm.
And, what he pointed out is he's like, do you feel this unsettled feeling when you're working? I'm like, no, I love what I do when I work. He's like, so it's basically whenever you're not occupied with something, you just feel totally restless. And I was like, oh yeah, ADHD, there it is again.
So interesting. Yeah.
But I found that like this huge switch of like self-compassion and inspiration flipped when I was finally like, okay, there's a reason that I've always felt kind of different from other people. And, when I try to do everything, like the in the box way, it's a struggle, but then every now and then when I just wing it and I trust myself, all these great things happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had a couple colleagues be like, oh, have you looked into coaching? I'm like, yeah, of course I have. I just got this coaching degree.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, so what are you doing with it? So then I initially didn't feel ready. I did some trainings, talked to a bunch of colleagues, read a bunch of books, and I was like, oh, I do kind of know this. And then
I was going to say,
started asking for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like you had a bit of imposter syndrome, and
oh, totally.
Yeah. And I think we all feel like that. Like, we feel like, okay, I just have to be like super prepared. Like, I have to, before I dip my toe in, I have to like know that I know everything. But the reality is like, you do already know a lot, and you're ready, like, and then
Absolutely.
and then you keep learning.
Well, the other part too is, once I started it, because people would refer me and they're like, you're ready, I'm just going to send you people, you don't have a choice. So I kind of repeated my first foray into ET.
Yeah.
I would do my best to really listen and hold space and meet people where they were and come up with strategies. And it was working, but then I'd be like, okay, like I'm not following so and so's model. And all the people I looked up to are like, executive function is super messy. It's really about helping the clients become like really self aware and find out how their brain works and develop strategies accordingly.
Yep.
And then I was like, oh, okay, I do know what I'm doing.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's that highest level, the metacognition, right? Like, can I?
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yep. So, okay. So now what does your practice look like and what is it called and how do people find you if they want to refer to you? Because you're basically talking to a whole bunch of educators who might come across the need for an expert in math and executive function.
Yeah. So I just go by my name because, again, decisions are hard. And I was like, okay, well, I know I'm always going to be my name. So my website is my name. It's www.stefanost.com. And you can reach me through there. And you could probably reach me on LinkedIn. I try not to check it that often. Except when I'm looking for other referrals. But I'll get to that in a minute because I know we wanted to get into just how to start your own practice.
Yeah, yeah. And your practice now is completely virtual, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you can see people anywhere.
Yeah, I do occasionally take on in-person students if they're really, really close to me. I still love the in-person work, but for the most part, I'm virtual.
And where are you exactly? Because in case people want you for in-person.
Yeah, I'm in Foster City.
Okay.
So for those of you who are close enough to do in person, you might know where that is.
Yeah.
For those of you super far away, it's between San Francisco and Stanford or San Jose.
Yeah. Okay, well, great. And then so tell me just a couple of things that you learned as a business owner that you think are important, or were important learning, aspects of learning for you, or things that came up that you didn't know, or guidance that you might give others in their quest for, business development.
Yeah. So I know this has been said on previous episodes of yours, but if you think you're ready, then you've probably waited too long. And if you think you're almost ready, that's just the right time. And if you have to be ready because you really don't have a choice, then you're probably ready.
Right. Yeah.
The other thing, most useful thing for me is get a really good accountant, find out how you want to get paid, find out if finances are or aren't your thing.
Yeah.
And especially being a solo business owner, like figure out what you really, really, really have to learn versus what you can outsource.
Yeah.
So like billing's not my thing. I think we use the same client management system.
Yep.
I set it up once and now it runs forever and it's linked to my business account. And at the end of the year, I hand my accountant a spreadsheet and I'm like, okay, do your thing.
Exactly. Yep. I highly recommend an EHR. And I wished that I had done it when I very first started and I didn't, just because I didn't know. And, so I probably waited, I don't know, 9 months, maybe a little over a year, but it, because I waited, I did not have everything in one place for my tax guy, at the end of the year. And it is so much easier. And it's really not expensive. It pays for itself, I think, in the amount of time that it saves, especially as a solo practitioner.
Yeah. And in terms of time and money too, and especially if you have any kind of learning differences or executive function challenges, like hire away whatever you're not good at.
Yeah. Yep. Have you, besides using an EHR, what have you hired people to do, or what have you found out?
It's only been for professional development. So mentors, supervisors through the ADP process, professional development.
Yeah.
But I like to keep a really, really, really lean overhead.
Yeah. Very good. Cool.
Were we going to talk like marketing, networking?
Yeah.
Really quick?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So yeah, for me, like that's where the imposter syndrome really came up because I'd go on LinkedIn, I'd see these people who have these like beautifully done web pages and all this content. And I was like, oh man, like is everyone 100 steps ahead of me? And in reality, it's like, no, they hired a really good web designer, they hired a really good marketer. And I threw my website together well enough just for a place to find me initially. But I've learned that one of my strengths is talking to parents and students directly because I ask people, like, why did you pick me? And they're like, oh, well, you're just so passionate about it. And you ask all these really good questions that, nobody else we've been to has asked before. So I've just learned to lean into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what's also come with that is I get to help a lot of people out in these small 15-minute consultations where, they'll show up and they're like, hey, here's the deal with my kid. And I'm like, okay, you don't need me, you need an advocate. And they're like, oh, really? I didn't know, like, I don't even know what this IEP thing is. I'm like, no, like, go here.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
And then it feels really satisfying to talk to someone for a couple minutes and then having this network now be like, oh, you're a, Jana person, you're a such and such person.
Mm-hmm.
And then I don't know, I think in sales we call those warm leads, but then I'll just do the email intro. I'm like, hey, Jan and so, I think you guys would be great. Take it from here.
Right. Yeah, so like what you're saying is like not only like if you're a small business owner, you are also doing sales and marketing.
Yep.
Yep.
But marketing, yeah, if you only look at LinkedIn marketers selling marketing, you'll get this very narrow view of what marketing actually is. Because everyone, uses fear-based, like, oh, if you're not on social, how are people going to, find your message? I think I have like 1,000 followers on LinkedIn. And if I post something, I don't know if it's going to land on the right ears anyway.
Yeah. Yep.
So what I use LinkedIn for is, I'll spend like maybe 15 minutes a week on it. And I'll just look for really cool people who are doing the same kind of work that I do. And I'll reach out to them like, here's what I really like. So something personal. So I've actually taken the time to read. And then can I refer to you? Because the reality is, as a small business owner and private practitioner, you get more referrals than you can take, but you want to help everybody. So it's so good to have just places to send. And sometimes it comes back, sometimes it doesn't. But, the main goal of this work, as I said from the beginning, is just to help as many people as possible. And sometimes that's as simple as just an email handoff.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I'm very, very big on making sure that like we try our best to make it an efficient process for people to get what they need, whether or not it's with us. So that network is so important to know who does what in our areas. And I'm 100% with you that it's like the actual personal network that we have and those like quote unquote warm leads are like that's what's going to get people help faster.
Yeah. And to me, it also mirrors the transition from working in public school or working in schools to private practice, which is like, you don't have to do your best with people who aren't a good fit. That's probably not even your best work. Best work is just knowing enough of who's out there to just get them to the next person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's the beautiful thing about private practice is that you don't have to take everything that comes across your desk because you may not feel 100% comfortable with it. But at school, you don't have a choice. You are it. You are it. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Well, tell me, lastly, I want to ask you just about what you have coming up, because I think you have a kind of an exciting venture you're working on with a colleague. I want to hear about it.
Yeah. So kind of the next stage in my professional development is trying to reach just more people and just give as much information and help as I can away. So I'm trying to challenge myself to do more talks. And then the project I'm really excited about is a colleague of mine and I, Kim Tran. She's amazing, brilliant EF person. Can I actually plug her too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think her website is kimtranefcoaching.com. But we're starting a podcast just talking about strategies and like those really big picture questions for neurodivergent adults. So like, how do you succeed in the workplace? How do you succeed in relationships? And, just looking at how a lot of the standard advice in popular psychology or the internet kind of falls short.
Yeah.
Because, we've seen that from our clients' experience and we've seen it from our own. It's like, okay, how do I get more organized? Oh, read Slow Productivity, use an Eisenhower matrix, use a planner, but like find your people. But how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, what's your why for doing these things?
Yeah. And what's your podcast going to be called?
We're still workshopping that.
Okay.
Definitely keep you updated.
Yeah.
We sat down today and we planned out like 5 episodes and we're like, we'll come back to the title.
Yeah. Yeah. Nice. Well, that's so awesome. Are you going to do it just the two of you? Or are you going to bring guests on? Like, what's your...
We're definitely bringing guests on. So yeah, we're going to have each guest not only kind of match the topic and give more in-depth information, but also be available for mentoring listeners, just if they feel like that person speaks to them.
Yeah.
Because I know that something that was really hard for me when I got into private practice was connecting with the right mentors. And I just see that with so many of the high schoolers and adults I work with. It's like, if you don't want to go the traditional college path, or if you're really struggling in your career, I think there's this, very popular myth in our society that, oh, you have to figure it on your own, and nobody figures anything out on their own.
Yep. Yep.
Like that's a good way to just kind of drown yourself and stay stagnant.
Yeah.
So you do have to connect with people who are going to challenge you and people who speak to you. And I think like that's the turning point in pretty much every success story I've ever heard is, I was going along, didn't know it, and then boom, the right person appeared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's on you to make that right person appear.
Right. Right. And that's so hard. It's so hard. Well, I was just talking about this on a previous podcast episode, but that transition age youth, it is, especially for the neurodivergent population, or the population of people who sometimes have challenges in that area, because it's very hard to even know who to find. I have two specialists here who were special educators, just like yourself, and they love working with transition age youth on that, like those next steps into adulthood and supporting, like they love to support that process. And there are just very few resources available that they could reach out to. And if they do, like, it's such a process to even reach out. Like if you go to the Department of Rehabilitation, like that process is cumbersome and
not EF friendly.
No, it is not EF friendly. It's not even friendly.
Yeah.
Like, and it's hard for them to keep staff, I mean, so anyway, yeah, I love that. I love that you want people to be available for some mentorship, because they could really speak to a listener who needs some support.
Well, I also think that's like the core question that we have to ask as educators is like, what does an education even mean anymore for, these people who aren't going to fit in the box?
Right.
Is the work, well, make yourself fit in the box and just be miserable, or is it make your own box, or
I love that.
Screw the box.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel like everyone who's transitioned to private practice, that's been the beauty of it is, I had this mission, I have these skills, but the way that I was forced to do it just didn't work.
Yeah. Yep.
And I see so many students like that too. It's like, oh, where are they going to go to college? And students like, I don't want to go to college, but I taught myself, video production on YouTube, and people are already paying me. Like, why can't I become an electrician?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, I love that. You'll definitely have to keep me updated and posted as you build that out. So listen in. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show. You are really
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're like the first special educator that, like was a special education teacher before transitioning into a private practice. And so it's been interesting to hear your story and kind of how that came to be. And there are a lot of people out there like you, and we're kind of similar in, just coming from public education and taking the skills that we know that we have and the love for the career and for the world of
the mission of helping others, right. And doing it in alignment with our own values.
Exactly.
And be in alignment with their own values.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better. That was perfect. Thank you for finishing my sentence.
No problem.
All right. Well, Stefan Oste, thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jana Parker.
This episode of the Empower LEP podcast is brought to you by one of my newest trainings on the Empower LEP platform, How to Network and Grow Your Business. This was one of my favorite trainings to record because it's one of my favorite things to do. And while this may not be one of everyone's favorite things to do, networking is absolutely essential for growing your practice. So we are going to talk about all things networking in this course. It is self-paced. You can get it on empowerlep.com. Thank you for listening to the Empower LEP podcast. Episodes can be found at empowerlep.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave a 5-star rating and review on your favorite podcast player. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, or if you have any questions for me, don't hesitate to connect. I would love to learn more. I can be found at jana@empowerlep.com.